Okay, so one-click shopping.
Right.
Like, we all do it. It's so easy. But then you start thinking about it and you send us this collection of articles and research, and it really makes you wonder, what's the hidden cost of all this convenience? Is it somehow connected to, like, a widening gap, some pretty big inequalities we're seeing across the country? So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack that, this whole impact of these really rapid economic shifts and the rise of these, giants, these huge companies, especially Amazon, and how it's affecting different regions and communities.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the material you sent brings together all these things that seem kind of separate at first, Like you have the affordability crisis in these booming cities, then you have these other communities that used to be manufacturing hubs, and now they're struggling. But the sources you sent, they actually connect it all back to this core theme, this growing regional economic divergence. And it all comes down to how wealth and opportunity are becoming so concentrated in just a few places.
Right.
And using Amazon as a lens to look at all of this, it really helps to see how all these issues are actually intertwined.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's what we want to do in this deep dive, is to extract the key insights from all this material you gave us. We really want to understand these powerful forces that are literally reshaping the American economic landscape, and not just in some abstract way, but what it means for actual people, for individuals, for, us.
Right, for everyone.
So let's start with this widening gap, this rise of regional inequality that keeps coming up in all these sources. What's the main takeaway there?
Well, the evidence is pretty stark. The research points to this pattern of wealth just piling up in a handful of urban hubs. And it's not even just between states anymore. Your sources highlight disparities within regions themselves. Think about the Bay Area. San Francisco, it's ridiculously expensive to live there, but then you have this huge problem with homelessness. And so many people are forced to commute crazy long distances from places like Stockton, which are more affordable. But man, those commutes.
It's like a tale of two cities within the same region. And it's not just a social issue, right? The articles you sent, they make it clear that economists and sociologists are seriously concerned about this.
Yeah, they're raising red flags. And your sources emphasize that this regional inequality, it's not some isolated thing. It's directly tied to the broader income inequality across the nation. And it's so significant that Moody's, the credit rating agency, they've actually warned about potential damage to the whole U.S. credit structure. They're saying it could have serious long-term effects on economic growth if this gap keeps widening.
Wow, so it really is a big deal. And this idea of a winner-take-all economy keeps popping up. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that actually mean in terms of regional inequality?
It boils down to this.
Yeah.
You have a few super dominant companies that are controlling whole sectors like media, retail, finance, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And as they get bigger, it's all the profits and growth opportunities, they're being sucked towards their headquarters, like a black hole, instead of being spread out across tons of smaller and mid-sized businesses all over the country. So you end up with this huge geographic concentration of wealth at the very top, and that really drives regional disparities. And it's hard to escape because the bigger these companies get, the more valuable their platforms become just by having more users. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. Hard for smaller players to even get a foothold.
It's like this magnet pulling everything into its orbit. And the articles are really clear that regional inequality and this national income inequality, they're not separate problems, they're two sides of the same coin. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, Amazon. Your sources really paint them as not just a player in all of this, but almost a symbol of these modern economic forces.
Yeah, and I think that's really perceptive. Amazon's very structure is like a microcosm of national wealth inequality. You have the founder, one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and then you have the massive workforce, and, well, let's just say their wages don't exactly reflect the company's overall success. What's striking about Amazon is that it's both a symptom of these national inequalities and a driving force behind them. It's like this extreme example of wealth creation at the very top, but then you have to look at the impact on local economies, on labor practices, on the environment even. It's all connected.
And it's not just about the distribution of wealth. It's about how we all behave as consumers. How we shop has completely changed. For millions of people, Amazon is way beyond just being convenient. It's become almost essential. And one of the articles even suggested that, maybe without meaning to, government regulations actually helped create this environment where Amazon could just keep growing.
Right. Some of your sources pointed to how certain tax laws have been interpreted, or how infrastructure development has been prioritized. And some people argue that those policies, whether intentionally or not, ended up benefiting these huge online retailers that already have these vast logistics networks. It's a thorny issue with lots of different opinions on whether this was deliberate or just like an unintended consequence of broader policies.
Right, and it makes you think. So while Amazon's doing great, your sources also highlight the very real consequences for all those local businesses, the smaller competitors that are facing closures, layoffs. It's like this convenience comes at a cost.
Absolutely. And we can't ignore the human cost either. The material you sent, it raises serious concerns about the well-being of the workers in those fulfillment centers. That phrase, one-click overwork, it's so powerful because it forces us to think about what's happening to the people behind this efficiency machine.
It's a good point. Like, how sustainable is this model, not just for businesses, but for the workers themselves? Let's zoom in on some specific examples. You included some great stuff about Seattle and how it's evolved over time. It's almost like 3 distinct chapters in the city's economic story.
I like that, 3 chapters. So early Seattle, it was a smaller city, very much tied to those traditional industries, Boeing, shipbuilding, the port. Even in the 70s, it had that frontier town feel. But the articles mentioned that its per capita income wasn't all that high compared to other big industrial cities. But then came the Boeing bust and the economic downturn that followed. That really shook things up. It was a time of real uncertainty. And that iconic billboard, the one that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" That really captured the mood.
Yeah, a lot of anxiety. But then we get to what you call the second Seattle, this period of growth and change, but not just economic growth. This was also when Seattle's Black community really started to develop, especially in the Central District.
Right. And what's important to note is that, in 1968, they passed those housing anti-discrimination laws. And that set off this whole process of trying to achieve real integration and equality. But it was slow going.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of challenges along the way. This period was really crucial, though, because it laid the foundation, both socially and demographically, for what was coming next.
And that brings us to the third Seattle, the era of the tech boom. This period of incredible wealth driven by companies like Microsoft, Starbucks, Nordstrom, and of course the big one, Amazon, which has completely transformed the city.
It really has. Your sources emphasize just how massive Amazon's footprint is in this third Seattle. The sheer number of employees they have, how much office space they occupy, the high salaries they offer, it's all huge. But, and this is a big but, this prosperity also exists alongside some serious problems. Displacement and affordability crisis that's just getting worse.
And then there's the gentrification, especially in South Lake Union, where all those old industrial areas were turned into Amazon's massive campus. That's a pretty clear illustration of how fast things have changed and the consequences that come with it.
Definitely. And your sources don't shy away from the effects on housing costs, like that example of Milo and Wendy and how much their rent went up. But it goes beyond just the financial burden. It's about people being pushed out of their homes, being displaced, especially in the Central District, which has historically been the heart of Seattle's Black community. The lyrics from that Dre song you included, it really captures that feeling of being uprooted, of losing that sense of community.
It's economic progress for some, but at what cost to others? Now, let's switch gears and look at another case study you provided, Dayton, Ohio. This is a city with a very different history and economic trajectory, right?
Absolutely. Dayton's story really contrasts with Seattle's. The material you sent talks about its history as a Republican stronghold and then the economic struggles it's faced, especially with the decline of its manufacturing base. It used to be so strong, a real hub for innovation. And then you see the impact of mergers, the challenges for the working class, and the devastating effects of the opioid crisis, like with Todd's story.
Yeah, so it's a city that was once at the forefront of American innovation, and now it's facing some real hardship. And then Amazon comes along and chooses Dayton for a fulfillment center. The way your sources present this is interesting. It's like Dayton, this former innovator, is now serving this new, distant innovator.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic in a way. And, on a practical level, it makes sense why Amazon chose Dayton. It's strategically located near major highways. It has existing logistics infrastructure. It's a prime spot for distribution. But your sources also point out that Ohio offered Amazon some pretty significant tax breaks and incentives to come there.
So it brings jobs, but it makes you wonder, what did Dayton have to give up to get those jobs? Let's shift our focus again, this time to Hagerstown and Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The material you sent really highlights the realities of warehouse work in those areas.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the death of Jody Rhodes at that Amazon fulfillment center in Carlisle is a really sobering example of the risks and the
Hmm.
pressures inside those environments. Your sources detail the OSHA investigation, the settlement that came later, and it really underscores the concerns about worker safety, the potential dangers.
And the descriptions of the work itself are pretty intense. The constant movement, the reliance on pain relief just to get through the day, the feeling of being more like a machine than a person. And it all comes back to those demands for efficiency, driven by automation.
Yeah, that's a key point. It's like the system is designed to squeeze every ounce of productivity out of the workers. And it makes that earlier contrast with, the story about Milo Dukic and the Dharmic engineers in early Seattle. It really highlights how much the nature of work has changed. Back then, it was more localized. There was a different connection between work and community.
It really shows how different the economic realities are for so many people today compared to like previous generations.
Mhm.
Okay, let's move on to Washington, D.C., which is another region that's going through a major transformation, but it's being driven by different forces than, say, Seattle or Dayton, right?
Right. DC's story is all about the rise of the influence industry, as your sources put it. This huge growth was initially spurred by the Great Society programs and the business community's reaction to increasing regulation from the federal government. So you see this rise of corporate PACs, lobbying efforts. It becomes a defining characteristic of the city.
So instead of traditional industries, you have this booming sector that's all about shaping policy. And your sources also talk about a big influx of wealth into D.C., especially after 9/11 and the expansion of the national security apparatus.
Exactly. And you see it everywhere,
Mm.
High-end consumption, luxury retail, fine dining, it's all booming. But at the same time, the cost of housing is skyrocketing, and the economic disparities within the city are becoming more and more obvious.
And then there's that revolving door phenomenon, people going back and forth between government and various industries. That's always been a part of DC, but your sources suggest that it's not the same industries that are dominating that revolving door anymore.
That's an interesting point. Finance has always had a huge lobbying presence in D.C., but what your material shows is that the tech industry, which used to be kind of hands-off, they really stepped up their game. As their influence has grown and as they face more regulatory scrutiny, they've established a pretty massive presence in Washington.
Which brings us to Amazon's HQ2 and the whole process of selecting Northern Virginia. That was a huge deal with big economic implications for the region.
No doubt. The promise of all those new jobs, the investment, it was a big draw. But your sources also raise those concerns about affordability and the potential for even more displacement, especially in an area where housing is already so expensive. And the whole bidding war between cities trying to attract Amazon, it really shows how much power these giant corporations have.
Yeah, it's like they're calling the shots. And that leads us to the whole issue of taxation and corporate responsibility, which your sources really dig into.
Yeah, they do. And what they reveal is that Amazon has all these strategies for minimizing its tax burden,
Right.
both at the state and federal levels. Negotiating those tax incentives, using international tax structures, it's all part of the game.
Mm.
And that whole controversy around the Seattle head tax and how it was eventually repealed, that's a prime example of this complex and often contentious relationship between these corporations and the cities where they operate.
It seems like a constant tug of war and the stakes are high. And your sources also touch on this idea of philanthropy, as an alternative to contributing more broadly to the economy.
Right, like can individual acts of generosity really address these systemic issues of tax avoidance and economic inequality?
Yeah.
And there are interesting historical parallels, like Andrew Carnegie's philosophy, this idea that wealthy individuals have a responsibility to use their surplus wealth for the good of society. And even today, you have examples like David Rubenstein and his philanthropic activities in D.C.
It's a good question, though. Like, is philanthropy enough? Now, let's talk about the decline of traditional industries and how that's impacting communities. That's another big theme in the material you sent. And the story of Bethlehem Steel in Sparrows Point, Maryland, is a really powerful illustration of this.
It really is. Bethlehem Steel is a classic example of what we've seen happen across so many industrial sectors.
Yeah.
The impact of deindustrialization on workers and communities, it's been profound. And it's interesting, your sources talk about the initial resistance to integration at the plant, but also how later on it actually provided some economic stability for Black workers compared to other jobs in the region. But when it finally closed, the reaction from the community was a real sense of loss. Like a part of their identity was gone.
It's not just about the jobs. It's about a way of life disappearing. And the story of Gone Bros, that department store in York, Pennsylvania, it shows another angle of these shifts. this time in the retail world.
Gone Bros. It's a great example of that transition from downtown shopping to the suburban malls, and how tough it is for these small-town businesses to keep up with such rapid changes in the retail landscape. But what's inspiring is that they tried to adapt while still serving their community, that loyal customer base in small-town America.
And then you have places like Nelsonville, Ohio, and Rocky Shoes and Boots. They're kind of taking a different path. A small town trying to find its niche, but still facing those same underlying economic pressures like Taylor Sappington talked about.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the difference between the kind of skilled work that was so prevalent in the past, often rooted in the local community, and then the nature of a lot of these modern warehouse jobs. And kind of symbolic that the old Sparrows Point steel mill site is now the Trade Point Atlantic Logistics Center, with, you guessed it, Amazon as a major tenant.
Wow, full circle. Yeah. A very literal representation of one economic era ending and another beginning. Okay, let's wrap this up by looking at the human cost of this new economy, bringing together all these different threads we've been talking about.
Right, so we're back to those warehouse workers, those demanding conditions, the constant surveillance, the limited opportunities for advancement. And then you have the unionization efforts at Amazon and how the companies responded, like raising the minimum wage. But your sources point out that while a raise is good, it doesn't magically solve all the problems. It doesn't address the concerns about working conditions or offer the same level of job security and benefits that previous generations had.
And this whole rise of e-commerce, it's incredibly convenient for us as consumers, but it's also had a huge impact on our traditional retail infrastructure. Malls closing down, more delivery trucks on the roads, more strain on our transportation systems.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways from all the material you sent is that stark contrast between those booming tech hubs and the smaller towns and cities that are really struggling. The benefits of this new economic landscape, they're not being shared equally.
So if we zoom out and look at the big picture, it's clear that there's some serious economic restructuring happening across the country. And wealth and opportunity, they're being concentrated in these specific geographic areas, often fueled by the growth and influence of companies like, Amazon.
Exactly. And as we've explored, this concentration has all these ripple effects. It's impacting regional economies, local communities, the lives of individuals. It's creating winners and losers. And importantly, it's making existing inequalities even worse.
Absolutely. And by going through all these stories, all this data from Seattle to Dayton to those warehouse workers, we can start to really understand these powerful forces that are shaping America today.
And this brings us to a question for you, the listener. As you consider all these trends, the concentration of wealth, the changing nature of work, how our communities are evolving, what do you think the long-term consequences will be for community cohesion, for economic mobility, for the future of work in this one-click America?
It really challenges us to think about, what are we trading off for all this convenience?
Yeah.
And how can individuals and communities navigate these massive economic shifts that are happening all around us? It's something we all need to keep thinking about.
For sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.